Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. In this week's video, I want to start a new discussion and share with you some of the changes that the Division of Workers' Compensation is proposing to make to the existing QME regulations. Now, with regards to the QME regulations, I don't know how often you actually read the QME regulations, but what I suggest to you is that you read the QME regulations, read and reread the QME regulations at least twice a year. Because it seems, at least speaking for myself, that each time I read and reread the QME regulations, I read the regulations with new eyes. And each time I reread the QME regulations, I pick up something new. I pick up something that I've been missing. I pick up something that I've been omitting, which when I start to implement that missing item, it always improves the content and the quality of my face-to-face evaluation and also the finished product, which is the final QME report. Now, the purpose of the QME regulations, and I should say that many times qualified medical evaluators look at the QME regulations as a series of hardships, as a series of rules, as a series of challenges, barriers, and difficulties that qualified medical evaluators have to surmount, or in the alternative, they just ignore the QME regulations. Well, I'm here to tell you that if you read the QME regulations, you'll realize that the purpose of the QME regulations is to make us better qualified medical evaluators and to help us learn how to author better qualified medical evaluation reports. In other words, the purposes of the QME regulations is to make us better at what it is that we do. So if you'll look at the QME regulations with an open mind and look at the reasoning behind each of the regulations, you'll realize that the reason is to make us better qualified medical evaluators. And I'm going to share with you a half a dozen to a dozen ideas today that will certainly help you become a better evaluator, beginning with your very next evaluation. Now, what I want to talk to you about today has to do with some of the proposed changes that the Division of Workers' Compensation has now already submitted. And these changes are now in the public comment period, and they're well on their way to being adopted into law, probably here in the very near future. Well, for us, we might as well begin now to start understanding the philosophy behind each of these new regulations, or each of the changes in the language of the regulations, so that we can begin taking the necessary action steps ourselves to become better evaluators. And what I want to share with you is from the proposed changes. I want to extract from the proposed changes those selections and those sections that are going to impact, or that are going to most dramatically impact, the day-to-day operations of you engaging in your QME practice. So what I want to share with you are some select passages from CCR 31.3 with regards to scheduling QME appointments. And it seems that now during the COVID or post-COVID area, there still seems to be some uncertainty as to when and how and where, and even where appointments can be scheduled. So we'll talk about that. I want to talk to you about evaluation and reporting guidelines that are described in Regulation 35.5. And as we now embark on the new era with a new medical legal fee schedule, these evaluation and reporting guidelines are even more critical, that we dot every I and that we cross every T of what it is that we're supposed to do, and that we do that quickly. So I want to share with you some ideas about how to do it right and how to do it quickly. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the new anti-bias regulations, and this is going to be a fascinating discussion for you, because it seems that discrimination and bias in the California workers' compensation system, and specifically In the work of qualified medical evaluators and in the work of the Disability Evaluation Unit, and really throughout the entire workers' compensation system, there seems to be quite a bit of bias and discrimination taking place. And the Division of Workers' Compensation is concerned enough about this to begin to shed new light on the topic, and the Division of Workers' Compensation is going to be requiring that we as qualified medical evaluators complete anti-bias training every 2 years. So I want to share with you where the division is going with that idea, and I want to start to open your mind about how you may possibly be guilty of possessing and harboring some biases in your evaluations yourself. So that's going to be a fascinating discussion for you. And then I want to share with you some new ideas about how you can service your reports electronically, which may be a new convenience for many of you as qualified medical evaluators, which will save you the time, the trouble, the hassle, and the expense of submitting and serving your reports the old way by snail mail. Now reports can be served electronically, and this tremendously increases the profitability of your evaluation by reducing and eliminating the costly and burdensome activity of processing and servicing your reports by snail mail. So this is going to help you tremendously. And then finally, I want to talk to you about the few pitfalls that qualified medical evaluators can stumble into unknowingly that can result in the denial of your reappointment as a qualified medical evaluator. And there's a bunch of these pitfalls, but I want to share with you the most common and the most likely areas where you could unknowingly get yourself into trouble and jeopardize your QME credential. We don't want that to happen. So I have some ideas to share with you as to how to practice safely and securely for many, many years to come as qualified medical evaluator. So with that as our introduction, let's begin today's program, which is our update on the QME regulations. Okay, so let's begin, and today we're talking about the new proposed changes that the Division of Workers' Compensation has already submitted for public comment, and these are changes to the existing QME regulations as the Division of Workers' Compensation attempts to further add tweaks to the system in an effort to make the system better. So the first thing I want to share with you today, and we'll just go through this very, very quickly, are some passages from CCR 31.3 regarding the scheduling of appointments with QMEs, with the panel QME. So this is in section C, 31.3C. So sections A and sections B talk about the time frames within which the parties can schedule the appointment with you as a qualified medical evaluator. But section E talks about your obligation as a qualified medical evaluator when it comes to scheduling that appointment. So I want to read for you directly from section E of 31.3. It says, if a party with the legal right to schedule an appointment with the QME is unable to obtain an appointment with the selected QME within 60 days of the date of the appointment request, okay? So your phone rings today and it's an applicant attorney's office and they're requesting an appointment. So today's the date of the request. And according to this section, you must schedule that appointment within 60 days. Within 60 days. Now it says if they're unable to obtain an appointment within 60 days, that party may waive the right to a replacement panel. In other words, if you can't schedule within 60 days, they have the right to get a replacement panel. But this section says that party may waive the right to a replacement panel in order to accept an appointment no more than 90 days after the date of the party's initial request for an appointment request. So if you're unavailable for 60 days and the parties really want you as the qualified medical evaluator, they may agree between the parties to go as long as 90 days in order to retain you as a qualified medical evaluator. But if the parties don't want you as a qualified medical evaluator, this is a perfect way for the parties to get a replacement panel and get another listing of 3 doctors from whom they can hopefully choose a more favorable evaluator. It says, when the selected QME is unable to schedule the evaluation within now 90 days of the date of the party's initial request for an appointment, either party may report the unavailability of the QME, and the medical director shall issue a replacement panel, unless both parties agree in writing to waive the 90-day time limit for scheduling the initial or subsequent, and this is new language, or subsequent evaluation. So this 60-day timeline applies to both your initial comprehensive evaluation, and it also applies to any follow-up face-to-face evaluation with the injured worker. So let's think about this for a minute. You know those times when your phone rings and one of the parties is asking, when are you or when is the doctor scheduling their QME appointments? The parties are trying to determine with this phone call, they're trying to determine their options. They're trying to determine what are their options for either using you as a qualified medical evaluator or having you as a qualified medical evaluator replaced through the issuance of a replacement panel. So they're calling to determine your availability. And if you're not available within 60 days, then their options open up. They open up tremendously. Now, the parties have a lot of options. They can agree to use you as a qualified medical evaluator. In other words, they can waive the 60-day requirement and they can go as long as 90 days. They can even go longer than 90 days, but that requires a written agreement from all parties, which may be difficult. But the point I want to share with you in introducing section 31.3, right, regarding scheduling, is that you're getting these phone calls where the parties are assessing your availability. Well, your opportunity to retain your position on the panel and possibly to obtain the evaluation is to be available within 60 days. So when you get those calls from one or more of the parties, the answer to the question, when is the doctor scheduling his very next appointment, the answer is somewhere between 30 and 60 days, 30 to 60 days. And you may phrase your answer to that question exactly like that. The doctor is scheduling between 30 and 60 days. And if you schedule between 30 and 60 days, you will always be quote unquote available for scheduling and not at risk of being reported as unavailable through the party's request for a replacement panel to get a new listing of 3 doctors, wherein again, the same cycle may repeat itself as the parties go through their options through the quote-unquote availability protocol, okay? So always make yourself available in less than 60 days. Okay, so always declare yourself to be available within the 60-day time period. Now, that doesn't mean that the parties may not then strike you from the panel when they learn of your availability. If the parties really don't want you, then that would be a reason for them to strike you from the panel once they learn that you are available within the 60-day time frame. But at least being available eliminates one of the parties' options to eliminate you as the potential evaluator through the request for a replacement panel. So your best bet to obtain each and every evaluation for which you get a phone call is to declare yourself available within the 60-day time frame. Okay, the next thing I want to talk to you about has to do with your evaluation and reporting guidelines. And I should tell you that the Division of Workers' Compensation scrutiny on your finished product report is going to be increasing over the next 1 to 2 to 3 years as the Division of Workers' Compensation attempts to satisfy the state auditor who accused the DWC of failing to ensure that QMEs produce what are referred to as high-quality reports. So in the interest of helping you comply with these reporting guidelines, I want to share with you a couple of passages from this particular section of the regulation. And this has to do with cover letters that you get. And we've talked about this in other programs, but it bears repeating here that according to section C1 of this regulation, it tells us that the evaluator shall address all contested medical issues arising from all injuries reported on one or more claim forms prior to the employee's appointment with the medical evaluator. Okay? So before the appointment with you, the employee must have provided or submitted a claim form wherein the employee describes his injuries. So all of those injuries are our obligation in the evaluation, as at least for those issues that are within the evaluator's scope of practice and areas of clinical competence. Okay? Now here comes the kicker, and we've talked about this in other programs, but it's very, very critical. It tells us that the reporting evaluator shall attempt to address each question raised by each party. So it could be as many as 2, 3 parties if you have an applicant attorney, defense attorney, and lo and behold, even a cover letter from the claims administrator. It could be 3 parties. The reporting evaluator shall attempt to address each question raised by each party in the issue cover letter sent to the evaluator. So let's talk about this for a minute. I've been to many workshops on QME report quality, and I've even attended 6-hour sessions, QME continuing education sessions, all concerned with improving the content and quality of QME reports. So it bears repeating that the reports that we write as qualified medical evaluators serve the parties. Okay, so our reports, the purpose of our reports are to answer the questions of the parties. The parties need an evaluation from us to resolve issues. And in order to resolve issues, they have questions to which they need answers to. Now, I'll tell you a story. I was working with a qualified medical evaluator just the other day, and we were going over this concept. And I was telling the qualified medical evaluator that he needs to answer in his report the questions. And the way you answer the questions that are sent to you in the cover letters is by using the language contained within the question. Okay? And I was working with a qualified medical evaluator just the other day, and I gave him this example. I said to him, let's say his name was Larry. I said, Larry, ask me if I watched last night's basketball game. And he says, okay. And he says, did you watch last night's basketball game? And I said to him, I hate basketball. And he replied, oh, okay. And there was a long pause. And I asked him, did I answer your question? And he said yes. He said yes. Where in actuality, I did not actually answer his question, did I? He asked me, did I watch last night's basketball game? Now, when I said, I hate basketball, you might infer from that, right? The listener infers. You might infer from that I did not watch last night's basketball game because I hate basketball so much that I don't watch basketball. You might have inferred that as the listener, and that might be true, that I did not watch the game because I hate basketball. But in actuality, I didn't answer the question. The question, did you watch last night's basketball game, is a yes or no question, isn't it? Correct? It's a yes or no question. So the answer to that question, which the parties want the answers to their questions. And the way you answer the question is you answer the question in the language with which the question is asked. So in the body of your report, you may say something like, no, I did not watch last night's basketball game, period. And that's a complete answer to the party's question. An answer like, I hate basketball. An answer like, there was a hockey game on the other channel. Or any other answer that is not a yes or no answer to the specific question is not an answer to the party's question. And so in the new era, and especially under the new medical legal fee schedule, and certainly with the Division of Workers' Compensation's newer and tighter scrutiny on our reports, it's more critical now than ever that you begin to devote more time to answering the questions that are sent to you in the cover letters that you received. And this time is time that you can borrow or steal from other aspects of your evaluation that are no longer as critical now under the new medical legal fee schedule. And now that the Division of Workers' Compensation is going to be closely eyeballing our reports, it's now more important than ever that we focus on answering the questions of the parties so that our report can satisfy the needs of the parties the first time through. Okay? The second thing I want to share with you, and this is something that qualified medical evaluators either don't know, or they just neglect it, or they just ignore it, and that is your reporting requirement when you are the first evaluator to declare the examinee to be permanent and stationary. And this comes from section C2 of 35.5. It says, if the evaluator declares the injured worker permanent and stationary for the body part evaluated, and the evaluator finds injury has caused permanent partial disability, the evaluator shall complete the physician's report of permanent and stationary status and work capacity, this is DWC form 10133, and serve it on the claims administrator together with the medical report. So if you're the first evaluator to declare the examinee permanent and stationary, say you're getting an evaluation where the primary treating physician has yet to declare the patient permanent and stationary, and you determine that the examinee is actually permanent and stationary, we're required to submit this form in those cases. Now, if the examinee is not permanent and stationary in your opinion, then this form is not required. But for those cases where you determine the examinee to be permanent and stationary, this is one more additional piece of paperwork that we're required to complete. And you've probably seen this form come with the cover letters that you receive, but many qualified medical evaluators just discard it or ignore it or omit it, when actually it's a required form, and it's required by law, and the law is 35.5. So I'm encouraging you to not neglect and not omit and not ignore this reporting requirement, because it's one of the areas that the division is going to be having increased scrutiny upon over the next year, 2 years, and 3 years as they attempt to improve the reporting of qualified medical evaluators. So there's a couple of guidelines that will help you in actually being a better and more compliant qualified medical evaluator. Okay, so the next thing that I want to share with you regarding the new proposed regulations is very, very important, and it represents a new direction by the Division of Workers' Compensation. And it has to do with their new focus on anti-bias in the workers' compensation system, and specifically for us, anti-bias in the qualified medical evaluation. And without getting into the whole story as to the genesis of this concern, let's just say that it's been long known and it's been long acknowledged as a problem, that there exists bias and discrimination in the workers' compensation system. And I have for you coming up very soon a complete 6-hour program on anti-bias training for us as qualified medical evaluators. But if you'll just agree with me for the purposes of today's discussion that there exists in our system much bias and much discrimination. And the Division of Workers' Compensation has addressed this for years, but their efforts have been unsatisfactory in eliminating bias and eliminating discrimination. So they're now taking new measures to ramp up against this pernicious problem. And to begin this discussion, which I want to spend a little bit of time with you on today, I want to begin by talking about the disclosure requirements, which are described in CCR 40. Now, the disclosure requirements tell us as qualified medical evaluators those things, those issues that we are required to disclose. They're called the required disclosures, the disclosure requirements, that we're required to disclose to the injured worker before we begin our evaluation. And I have CCR 40 here. Now, let me tell you that very few qualified medical evaluators go through the disclosure requirements with their injured workers, with their examinees, and I know this. The reason I know this is because many times when I'm with an injured worker, I'll go through the disclosure requirements many times with the assistance of an interpreter, and I always ask the interpreter, have they ever gone through such a process or procedure in other evaluations? And in every single case, the interpreter will tell me, no, never, no, never done that before, no, that's brand new. So I know that qualified medical evaluators are not doing this procedure. Now, this is a procedure that I invented. I invented this procedure in approximately 2009. I submitted my proposal on this procedure to the administrative director of the Division of Workers' Compensation, and we worked interactively to hone the procedure to where it exists today. And I can tell you that I've done this procedure thousands of times with thousands of injured workers, and it works beautifully. But for the purposes of today's discussion, the section from the disclosure requirements that I want to share with you is Section 2. And this is something we're required to tell the injured worker before we begin the evaluation. And that is that they, as the injured worker, they may discontinue the evaluation based on good cause. If they want, they can discontinue the evaluation with you. You need to inform them of that. It's required by law that they can discontinue the evaluation based on good cause. Well, what is good cause? Well, it tells us in the regulation. Good cause includes, number 1, discriminatory conduct by the evaluator towards the worker based on race, sex, national origin, religion, or sexual preference. Now, if you have any tone or attitude of discriminatory conduct related to any of these targets, the target of race, the target of sex, the target of national origin, religion, or the target of sexual preference, if you have any attitude, you must eliminate it now. You must eliminate it immediately, because if the examinee picks up on it and they're uncomfortable with it, they can discontinue the evaluation. So with the disclosure requirements, which have been in effect for years, the Division of Workers' Compensation initiated their attack against discriminatory conduct by qualified medical evaluators. Well, that attack is increasing in its ferocity with new section 35.5H of the new proposed QME regulations. And I have it here, and this is brand new. It says, each reporting evaluator shall include in the report a declaration under penalty of perjury. Don't we have so many declarations that we're now required to include in our reports? Well, guess what? We have a brand new one beginning upon the passage of these particular regulations, which is coming very, very soon. And the declaration under penalty of perjury must confirm that the evaluator did not discriminate in any way against the parties to the action or the injured worker in the evaluation process or in the content of the report. And isn't that incredible? As we get further into our discussion of anti-bias training in the QME evaluation, we're going to realize and see that bias exists in many shapes and forms and guises and disguises. And there's biases against the parties, there's biases against the claims administrator, there's biases against the defense attorney, there's biases against the applicant attorney, there's biases against injured workers based on their race, sex, national origin, based on their gender. And the Division of Workers' Compensation is intent on eliminating discrimination and bias in the QME evaluation. One of the ways that they're doing it is by requiring this declaration to be included in each and every report that we submit. Okay? The next is in CCR 5110, and let me bring that one up. And CCR 5110 has to do with denial of reappointment. Denial of reappointment has to do with discovery by the parties, particularly a workers' compensation judge, that the qualified medical evaluator failed to render expert opinions and conclusions without regard to an injured worker's race, sex, national origin, religion, or sexual preference. So here is built in a safeguard for the parties to have the qualified medical evaluator's reappointment denied when it's been demonstrated or discovered that the qualified medical evaluator is harboring and expressing biases and discrimination. And then finally, the Division of Workers' Compensation is so serious about this that they're ramping up and changing what they consider to be their continuing education requirements for us as qualified medical evaluators. You know, up till now, qualified medical evaluators are required to complete 12 hours of continuing education every 12 years. Well, the DWC, in the proposed new regulations, is increasing that requirement from 12 hours to 16 hours, and the Division of Workers' Compensation is introducing what they consider to be mandatory topics. So no longer are we going to be allowed to take courses on a variety of random and elective topics. There's going to be some required topics that will assist the Division of Workers' Compensation in gradually cranking up the quality of QME reports. And one of the new required topics that qualified medical evaluators will be required to complete every 2 years is 2 hours of instruction in anti-bias training, which meets the qualifications described in Regulation 11. And Regulation 11 deals with discrimination, deals with implicit and unconscious biases, which we'll talk about in an upcoming program. And it talks at great length about gender bias. And you may not know this as a qualified medical evaluator, and even I have to admit that when I discovered the multiple gender biases, plural, gender biases that are prevalent in the workers' compensation system and in the work that we do, I was shocked, and I'm going to be sharing some of these with you in an upcoming program. And I'm asking you as a qualified medical evaluator to take a hard look inside your own beliefs and discover what are your own biases and what are your own implicit biases. What are your preconceived notions about various genders, about various races, about various sexual preferences, and how do those translate into the opinions and conclusions that you provide in your QME reports? And what are your biases regarding the parties? Perhaps you've had the same claims administrator on multiple cases, and you've had some disagreement or disgruntlement with that claims administrator. Perhaps that might lead you to be biased against that particular claims administrator in the future. And we have all these biases, and we're going to be addressing these at great length in upcoming programs. And I simply introduce this to you here now to share with you where the Division of Workers' Compensation is going in the very near future. Okay, and then finally, the last two things I want to share with you regarding the new proposed changes to the QME regulations have to do with a couple of things that will make your evaluations easier for you to process and therefore more profitable for you. And then also some ideas that will help you practice safely as a qualified medical evaluator, enjoy a long, healthy, happy, and profitable career as a qualified medical evaluator. So the first thing has to do with making the work that we do easier, and has to do with the new allowance for electronic service of our reports on the parties. Now, all of you know and remember that during the coronavirus pandemic, the Division of Workers' Compensation passed some emergency regulations, one of which was the provision that allowed us to serve our reports on the parties electronically. Well, guess what? New changes to the language of CCR 36.7 extends and continues the provision or the allowance for electronic service of our reports on the parties into the future and on into forever. And the regulation goes on quite a bit as to what constitutes and what qualifies as an electronic service of records. And I'm not going to get into that discussion with you here in today's discussion. You can read that on your own. But suffice to say, for our purposes, this is a tremendous time saver, in that it allows us to eliminate all the negativities involved with sending our reports and serving our reports by snail mail. No longer do we have to go to the post office. No longer do we have to affix envelopes with postage. No longer do we have to print out pages and pages and pages and copies and copies and copies of our reports. These can now be submitted electronically with one singular touch on the send button. So at least on the administrative side of completing our qualified medical evaluating reports, at least on the admin side, this is a cost and energy and time saving measure for which I'm extremely grateful, and I'm sure you will be with your very first foray into servicing the parties with your reports electronically. So that constitutes good news. And then finally, I want to talk to you about how to practice safely as a qualified medical evaluator and forever stay out of the scrutiny of the Division of Workers' Compensation, and I have a couple of ideas for you. So CCR 51 of the new regulations, or some proposed new changes to the regulation, describe many circumstances that would disallow or prevent a qualified medical evaluator from being reappointed to a subsequent 2-year term. And the two that I want to share with you is section number 12 and then also section number 13. Section number 12, and I'll read it directly for you, it says, when it's discovered that you as the qualified medical evaluator have participated in 3 or more instances of activity during the most recent period of appointment, so that's a 2-year period of appointment, so 3 instances in a 2-year period that constitute a failure to communicate with the injured worker in a respectful, courteous, and professional manner. Now, this may be construed as an extension of the disclosure requirements, or it may be construed as an extension of the new philosophy of anti-bias in the qualified medical evaluation. But, or I should say, it specifically relates to the words respectful, courteous, and professional. So gone are the days where we as qualified medical evaluators can be casual and cavalier with injured workers, and in are the days where we as qualified medical evaluators eliminate biases, eliminate discriminatory tone and discriminatory attitude, and adopt respectful manners, courteous manners, and professional manners, such that our manners are beyond reproach by any party, especially the injured worker during the face-to-face evaluation. Okay? And then additionally, if it's discovered that you as the qualified medical evaluator participate in any intentional act, so this is the opposite of unintentional acts. If you're found to be participating in an intentional act that is not a necessary part of the physical examination, that causes physical harm or injury to the injured worker, this is a grounds and a basis for non-reappointment of your QME credential for a subsequent 2-year period. So what's the instruction that this regulation is providing us? It's telling us, don't harm the injured worker. Don't cause physical harm or injury to the injured worker. Don't participate in anything that's not necessary except the evaluation that is necessary. Now, this may be considered, again, to be an extension of the disclosure requirements. One of the disclosure requirements that we didn't discuss earlier says that the injured worker can discontinue the evaluation in instances where the evaluator requests the worker to submit to an unnecessary exam or procedure. So this is important for our examinees to know, that we're not going to be doing examination procedures that are not necessary. Sometimes this is important for women to understand in the context of a male evaluator. So you can reassure your examinee that, for example, they won't be required to disrobe or anything else that may be construed as unnecessary to the evaluation. Thus, it's a good idea for you to communicate with the examinee in advance about the examination procedures and gain their approval to proceed forward with the examination procedures that may be sensitive or may be construed as sensitive, such that you cannot be found in violation of this regulation, which talks about participating in any intentional act that is not a necessary part of the physical examination that causes physical harm or injury, and I'm sure that can be construed also as a psychological injury to the injured worker. Okay, so doctors, I hope this helps you. These new proposed changes to the QME regulations give us a fascinating insight into what the Division of Workers' Compensation sees as concerns and the directions that the Division of Workers' Compensation is pursuing in an effort to rectify such concerns. And if you review these regulations with an open mind, as I've done many times, I've realized for some years now that the purpose of these regulations are to make us better evaluators. There's nothing in any of these regulations that are not reasonable, that are not commonsensible, that are not designed to improve the system that we all participate in and that we all enjoy and that we all benefit from. And so I'm encouraging you to read and review and understand and implement the suggestions contained within these new proposed regulations. And I'll be sharing more on these with you in the future, including a complete training on anti-bias training. So doctors, I want to thank you for your commitment to excellence and thank you for participating as a qualified medical evaluator. We need now more than ever excellent, committed, and enthusiastic qualified medical evaluators. And so the purpose of these ongoing discussions is to help you become a better evaluator and to enjoy a long, successful, and profitable career as a qualified medical evaluator. So for today, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter wishing you best of success.